We already have the basic definition of the user interface and some of the functionality for this expenses application. Now, during the rest of this section, we're going to finish up the functionality and have everything be done with MVVM. So, during this lecture, we're going to start to work with commands. So, commands, if you do not remember or if you haven't used commands before, are pretty much what are going to substitute or replace entirely all of those event handlers that you probably had before implementing MVVM. Now, of course, in here we are implementing MVVM from the start, so we don't have any event handlers but we can think where we would have something that has to respond to an interaction from the user. So in the main page, we really have to do nothing. Of course, the tabs are going to respond by themselves, and we already saw that in the previous lecture. The categories page is also not going to require any command right now. We don't really need to respond to anything from the user. Now, the expenses page does have a toolbar item. So we need a command for when the toolbar item is selected, so we get navigated to the new expenses page. So let's go ahead and do that. In the expenses VM class, we are already getting the expenses. We're not yet going to be listing this. What I want to create in here is, first of all, the method that is going to execute the functionality for that add button. So what I will do here is set a public void add expense method that is simply going to navigate over to the new expense page. So the best way for us to navigate over to a new page from an MVVM pattern or within the MVVM pattern, in here we are definitely not on a page, is to get from the app, or it's even better to use application from the Xamarin Forms namespace, get the current application, which is really just the app class. If you didn't notice, the app class inherits from application. So that is what I'm accessing here with current. And current is going to have a main page, which is actually a page, because if you remember, we set the app class to be a navigation page, which starts in the main page. But now main page is actually going to have the navigation property and of course the push async method. All we need to do now is tell this method to where are we going to be navigated. So I will simply create a new expense page. Need to add a using directive here. And there we go. This is what needs to be executed when the add button instead of the toolbar of this content page is selected. Now, how do we respond to that? With commands. So let me go ahead and create a command. And it's always a good practice to define all of your properties before the constructor of a class and then all of the methods after the constructor of the class. Just a good practice. So before the constructor, I am going to define a new property that is going to be a command. And my command is simply going to be called add expense command. Now in the constructor, before everything else, I want to initialize the add expense command. And this is going to be equal to a new command. Now notice that inside of the constructor for the command, we can do many things. And one of them is precisely setting the action that is going to be executed when this is pressed. So what I can do is simply set it to the add expense method. So that is how we create the command and how we set what method is going to be executed when the command fires. The important thing in here, or the other important thing in here, is for this toolbar item to execute the command when it is pressed. So how do we do that? Well, in here we have to add a few lines of code here on my SAML page. So what we have to do is somehow bind to this command that is coming from the expenses VM. So the first thing that I will need, if you think about it, is to get an instance of the expenses VM. So this is probably something that you're familiar with on SAML if you have used it before. The first thing that I will need is a new namespace reference. So I will write XMLNS and I will set an identifier. Let's call it that for now. This is going to be VM. And this is going to be pointing to my view models folder. So the namespace where all of my view models exist. So eventually, just like on C#, we can access the classes inside of that namespace. So I will go ahead and write CLR for Common Language Runtime namespace. And the one that I want to access is the expenses app.viewModels namespace. So I will write it like this. This will mean that I will now have access to this namespace directly from the content page, which means that I can now create a new resource that is going to be local to this content page, pointing to, in this case, the expenses VM, which is the one that I need right now. So I will go ahead and first of all access the content page's resources. And inside of the resources, Xamarin Forms works a little bit different, by the way, if you're familiar with resources, but maybe for WPF, here you have to set a resource dictionary. And inside of the resource dictionary, go ahead and define any resource that you want. The one that I want is inside of the VM namespace. And notice that indeed I have a list of all of the classes that are defined inside of this view model. So I will select expenses VM, and I will need to set a key to it. Through the key is that I will be able to later access this resource. Basically, this is going to create an instance of my expenses VM class and even make it available on design time. So now that I have this resource, I can actually go ahead and start to use it. So in the toolbar item, I am going to be defining the command. And the command is going to be set to some binding. Binding is precisely going to allow me to set some relationship with the actual VM or a specific resource. So the first thing that I will do is set the source. So where is the binding going to happen from? In this case, I already have a static resource that happens to be called VM. So just like this, now my toolbar item is going to use the expenses VM as the source for its binding. And once I have the source, I can set the path, and the path is any property that I have right here in my VM. And one of them happens to be a command. So I can set the path to the add expense command. Just like this, we are now going to be binding the command from our view model to this toolbar item. Before moving forward and implementing the other command that we have to add, let's go ahead and test this out. This time I'm going to be running on the iPhone X simulator. By the way, just now trying to execute, I did find a couple of things that I needed to change. First of all, I was setting the database path after the creation of the main page. So we were trying to access the database before the database path was established. What I did was establish this before creating that. And the other one is that I'm trying to clear the expenses observable collection without first having initialized it. So all I have to do is here on the constructor make sure that expenses is set to a new observable collection right from the beginning. So in case you didn't know how to solve these two quick issues, this is how you do that, and let's go ahead and test. Now this should work. So now that the app is up and running, by the way, you can see how this looks as you would expect on iOS. Let's navigate over to the expenses where we are going to see this plus icon, and if we select it, we are now navigated, which means that our command is successfully bound to our item. Now, you may have guessed it, the next command that we have to implement is the save command. In fact, in that case, we already have the method that needs to be executed. So let me go ahead and close this expense VM, and here on the new expense page is where we have that toolbar item, And in fact, in the new expense VM, we already have the insert expense method. Now in here, we do need a bit of extra work to do. The insert expense method is already returning an integer. Let me go ahead and get that integer and call it response. And what I will do is evaluate. If response is greater than 0, if this is true, I want to navigate back from this page because we have already inserted an expense. Maybe after this, we just want to go ahead and see the list of expenses. So what I will do is, again, from application, using directive, get the current one, get the main page, get the navigation, and I am going to pop async, which means that I'm going to be navigating back. If this is not true, what I could do is show an error message. So again, from application, .current.main page, in here I will be able to display an alert. To display an alert, again, we need some sort of page. This is how you can access a default page from MVVM from a class that is not a page. So what I will do is set a title in here that is going to be error. No items were inserted, and just OK. So very quick update into this method, so the user gets a bit of a better experience navigated back when the item has been successfully inserted, and just getting an error message if it wasn't. So now let's go ahead and create that command. Now in here, by the way, we already have all of these properties that eventually will be binding to all of the entries that we have up here. So we will need to do that as well, so our command actually works, because precisely the insert expense method is going to access these properties. So these properties should be bound to something. But let's for now just go ahead and create the property for the command. This is going to be the save expense command. We are going to be initializing it from the constructor. And the action in this case is going to be the insert expense method. So this would mean that it is the insert expense method that want to be executed when the command is executed. So now we will have to do something very similar over here in SAML that we did in the other page. First, setting the namespace reference to that namespace, so CLR-namespace, and this is the expenses app view models namespace as well. So let's just put that in here, which means that I will now be able to, from the content page, create some resource dictionary inside of the resources, and inside of the resource dictionary access that VM namespace, create a new expense VM variable or just resource in here, and set a key to it, which is going to be VM. Now, just like we did with the other toolbar, I will be able to set a command to some binding, have the source to that static resource that we have just created called VM, and set the path to the command that we have just defined, which is called save expense command. So now we should be able to execute that command now. However, currently we are not binding anything to the expenses name, the expenses amount, all of these properties. That is something that we will do in the next lecture. And in fact, this is something that I could test. I am going to set a breakpoint before anything else gets executed, and I will run this. So I will not let this keep running to insert an expense that is just not going to have actual values, but I will take a look at the method being executed. So I will navigate over here. I'm not even going to fill anything because it's not going to be used, but I'm going to click on save, and you see that this method is indeed going to be executed. So I will just stop this application from running, but you can see how the command is now correctly bound to, well, the command of that toolbar item. Now that this is done, in the next lecture, we are going to start binding the properties to all of these entries or all of these elements that we have, including the date picker and the picker for us to actually be able to create an expense that has the data that is inside of this form.